I just returned from spending 2 weeks in Japan, mainly Osaka and Kyoto, but it seems like I left my mark on the place because the day after I returned to rainy old England, Japan voted for remigration. They've elected their new Prime Minister. This is Sanae Takaichi, who is 64 years old. She grew up in Nara, and she was a staple of the late, great Shinzo Abe's cabinet. And the reasons we should celebrate this is not just because this gaijin has a great reverence for the nation of Japan, its polite and industrious people, its beautiful scenery, its rich culture, its interesting history. I'm really starting to sound like Tom Cruise in Last Samurai now, aren't I? But it's also because it's facing the same civilizational challenges that we are in the West, and that is relentless pressure to accept mass third world migration and replace its own population for expedient economic gains at the expense of the continuity of its culture and the ability to recover from its demographic malaise. And so I want to go through some of the issues that Japan is facing, both from a macro statistical level and from a micro anecdotal level, some of the stuff that I saw on the ground and photographed while I was there, and then explain exactly why this woman has been elected Japan's Prime Minister after Abe was assassinated, and then a rather unpopular government took power and started opening Japan's doors to international bodies like the United Nations, and, of course, their social engineering policies, like gender progressivism and mass migration. I must say as well that I saw the little wheel of the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals pretty much everywhere, including on multiple people's lapels as little jacket pins that people were wearing. That's not even something we see in the UK, which has totally capitulated to the UN's international open borders agenda. So something very worrying to watch out for all my friends in Japan. And when I was back on the Lotus Eaters, we had multiple segments translated into Japanese and re-uploaded on YouTube. If someone can do that here, I would be very grateful, because I really hope the Japanese understand that they have lots of admirers and allies over in the Anglosphere who want to see their nation thrive once again, and who hope this is truly a turning point for Japanese politics to address the issues that plague them and prevent them from making the same mistakes that my country has. And the hope is, actually, that Japan can become a model nation, as it's poised to be, and that when we win over here in Britain, we can not just copy what the Japanese have done, but actually invite the Japanese to come over and help us do things like build a Shinkansen from London to Glasgow. Considering we helped them build their railways and basically gave the world the Industrial Revolution, it's only right that the nation that's pretty much perfected it helps us when we're in our own demographic and cultural malaise. But anyway, so Takaichi grew up in Nara, wonderful little traditional town, centered around a massive Buddhist temple, and famous, of course, for the deer that roam wild and free, bowing before Japanese natives and tourists alike to be fed rice crackers. They're very friendly, cute things. She won after the Liberal Democratic Party formed a coalition with Ishin in the Diet, which is the Japanese parliament. And she was in Shinzo Abe's cabinet when he was first elected in 2002, and then when he was re-elected in 2012. And when Abe didn't seek re-election in 2021, she ran in his stead. He gave his support to her prior to his assassination in Nara, her hometown. And when he was assassinated, she posted on social media, "I have to work very hard today, otherwise I'd have to apologize to him." And we who appreciate what President Trump has done for America and his Anglophilia, looking out for us in the UK when our government is morphing into a failed Soviet state, also like the fact that Shinzo Abe was looking out for the Japanese people, was a close friend of President Trump, and so anyone who's fitting his mold and putting Japanese people first, well, seems like a positive development in my book. A side note, there were lots of posters up around Kyoto, where I spent a lot of my time, for parliamentary candidates, and I asked my wife, who speaks Japanese and can read and write kanji, she's very intelligent like that, to translate for me, and she said pretty much all the posters were saying putting Japanese people first. And it's encouraging that the Japanese have not, especially given their activities during the Second World War, succumbed to a post-war guilt complex that demands they have no preference for their people, their history, their heritage, their culture, and their identity, unlike we have been subjected to in Europe for decades of multicultural, liberal, blank slate brainwashing. The Japanese don't have that, and that means that despite their economic and demographic woes, they might be impervious to the arguments made by the advocates of replacement migration in NGOs, in the UN, in international media, who treat people like fungible economic units, and who say, if you have a preference for your own people and your own culture and your identity, you're a racist. Well, fortunately, they might be impervious to the racist arguments, and they might be impervious to the you should prioritize expedient economic growth over cultural continuity arguments that have plagued my country, and if they can succeed by doing that, then we might be able to have another example to point from Britain and say, hey, they're doing this, it works, we should do this too. We should just want what Japan has, or hopefully will have. This New York Times article is a fair write-up, actually, which is shocking from the New York Times, given their Trump derangement syndrome, of Takaichi's history. And it explains, and it just makes her sound really cool here, that she is an amateur drummer who idolizes bands like Iron Maiden and Deep Purple, and also wears blue suits to emulate her hero, the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. I hope that she takes Thatcher's immigration policies rather than the destruction of the domestic manufacturing capacity and the selling off of Japan's assets policies. Because, and we'll get onto the railways later because it's a topic of fascination that actually preoccupied a lot of my trip, a lot of the problems in Britain are actually to do with privatization, which is surprising, but when you privatize natural monopolies and you don't mandate that they are sold to domestic British companies, what ends up happening is what happened with Britain's railways, which is that failing British Rail was sold off to companies in the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, and the like. And so foreign companies and even foreign governments own our railway infrastructure. China owns part of Thames Water, our water infrastructure. And you need only look at the FOI request sent by my friend Lewis Brackpool to see that it turns out foreign governments don't have a great interest in maintaining the quality or the abundance of Britain's reservoirs. Our water is contaminated with lead and microplastics and birth control and all sorts of other pollutants and lethal chemicals. But not only do the water companies have no accountability to be held to, they also, if they're a foreign country, especially a country that doesn't like us very much, have an active incentive to sabotage our domestic resources and our utilities, because it makes us a weaker and more dependent country while they're building up their strength. So I hope that Takaichi follows the Margaret Thatcher playbook on having net negative migration, especially third world migration that's come to Japan recently, rather than her fairly reckless privatization strategy. Ms. Takaichi, a protege of Shinzo Abe, the New York Times writes, who was, of course, Japan's longest-serving prime minister and assassinated in 2022, is expected to move Japan further to the right, responding to a recent populist wave that bears some similarities to Donald Trump's MAGA movement. She has embraced hawkish policies on China, pushed the message that Japan is back, played down Japan's atrocities during World War II, and promised to strictly regulate immigration and tourism. You know, apart from the World War II revisionism, which might make the Brits and Americans a little bit sore, I think this all sounds excellent, and I really hope she delivers on her promises for the sake of the Japanese people. One such person who thinks this is Yoshiko Sakurai, who is a journalist and activist who supported Ms. Takaichi. He says she wants to make Japan strong and prosperous for the people of Japan and for the world. She is open to the outside world, but she also understands that we have to be really good Japanese. We have to know our culture, traditions, philosophy, and history. So basically, we can make friends with allied nations that revere our culture in the same ambiguous complementarity that, for example, men might revere women. We don't quite understand each other, we're not replaceable or fungible with one another, but we understand that our differences are what makes us able to form relationships with each other. And the same holds for countries. I would never dream of trying to culturally terraform Japan to make it more like England, and the reason I visit Japan is because it's distinct, it's beautiful, it's different. And I think, despite the Paris syndrome that a lot of Japanese tourists are getting from visiting London these days and finding it looks like a third world slum, I think when they envision England as the land of Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, they think of us in the same sort of magical, mythological frame. And so I think that the Japanese and the English, the Japanese and the Americans, the Japanese and the Australians, Japanese and the South Koreans might be able to foster stronger ties, devolve away from reliance on China for industrial and manufacturing capacity, and become independent, prosperous, and self-confident nations, practicing their own culture and putting the interests of their people first again. This all sounds excellent. Let's hope that she delivers on these promises and doesn't end up like another Giorgia Meloni, who is basically slowed down with the grit that is thrown into the political engine by vested interests and, in Italy, organised crime, but also the sclerotic treasury brain mentality that we must grow the GDP pie, and the only way to grow the GDP pie is to grow the population, and the only way to grow the population is immigration, despite the fact that people are not fungible, they bring their cultures with them, and if you do immigration for economic reasons, it always translates into immigration culturally terraforming your country beyond recognition, and you as a people can recover from cultural amnesia or demographic deficits or economic downturn. You cannot recover if the people are no longer the same, because countries are built by people, and only the Japanese could produce Japan. And so we want the Japanese people to stay a cohesive cultural and demographic majority, to get their birth rate up, and to restore their country again. And if she can make good on that promise, sounds brilliant. She also, during the recent campaign, complained about tourists kicking the deer of Nara Park, where she grew up. And I didn't notice this while I was out there. She was accused of being xenophobic for this, but, I mean, these are some photos that I took when I went to Nara, actually, on my 27th birthday. It was unfortunately pissing it down with rain for most of it, but the last time I went in 2023, it was wonderfully sunny and had a proper snow white movement feeding loads of the deer, as you can see here. Why you would ever abuse these animals is beyond me, but it turns out that lots of cultures are not like the Japanese. Well, at least with their land-faring animals, they're a bit funny when it comes to the seafaring ones. I've seen, obviously, lots of videos of them that eating live octopus in an advert for tourism that kept coming up when I was watching YouTube over there. So sort it out, guys. It's not very nice. Anyway, they're not like the English. They're not like the Americans. They're not like the Western Europeans, where they value animals for their own sake. They have a great affinity for the deer of Nara Park, who are frankly worth more to me than entire continents full of people at this point. And so if you invite those people from those regions of the world, as we've seen with the Hassan Piker controversy recently, Muslims aren't the biggest fan of dogs and don't treat them very well. If you invite people from regions of the world where they don't value animals as something to be conserved and cherished, then you're going to get the mistreatment of animals. So the solution is, just don't let those people from those places in. Like, I had to do an e-tourism visa QR code thing while I was in the passport queue to get into Japan. Okay, just block certain nations from being available for that. Just don't allow those people in as tourists to your country. Makes perfect sense to me, and I hope Takaichi takes that policy up. So let's look at the press's response, because they're not too keen on Takaichi. Reuters have written through gritted teeth here, Takaichi elected Japan's premier, shattering glass ceiling with hard right turn. So they're trying to add some weird feminist spin to it, because they're desperate for gender equality in a, quote, patriarchal society that is Japan. I think, actually, under, quote-unquote, feudal patriarchy, Japan had a much better birth rate, so it might be more advisable to return to that. However, they do note that their based girl boss is actually incredibly right-wing and doesn't take their line on immigration policy. They note that in her acceptance speech, she said, "I am determined to deliver results for the nation, to build a strong Japan, and to never give up." She's like that motivational fisherman in the meme. "I also plan to meet President Trump at an early date to elevate the Japan-US relationship to new heights." Excellent stuff. And I have heard from my friend Liz Truss, who knew her well before she was elected, that she's also a bit of an Anglophile, so hopefully when we win, Britain will be in a better position to promote good relations with Japan over terrible other countries like India. And India, as with any conversation about immigration or politics these days, will be brought up later, as usual, in a negative light. But it's the seething from the leftists in the international press that makes me optimistic about Takaichi, because this is from Politico. Japan's first female leader is an ultra-conservative star from a male-dominated party, and she asked all her lawmakers to work like a horse. So, in here, they write, she admires former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, is a proponent of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's conservative vision for Japan. She's a China hawk, a regular at the Yasukuni Shrine, seen by China and the two Koreas and other Asian victims of Japan's World War II aggression as a place that glorifies the country's wartime past. Again, something I can't get on board with, but Hey, it's probably going to come part and parcel with Japanese nationalism, isn't it? The leader of a country that ranks poorly internationally for gender equality, Takaichi has rarely mentioned the issue during the campaign. She did remark after winning the presidency of the ruling party, now that the LDP has its first female president, its scenery will change a little. But she's actually appointed fewer female ministers than was expected, and as we'll get onto later, one of the female ministers she has appointed has really upset the leftists in the international press, because despite being a finance minister, she's also the Minister for Remigration. Good stuff. She called for a stronger military, more fiscal spending for growth, promotion of nuclear fusion, cybersecurity, and tougher policies on immigration. All sounds fantastic, all sounds like stuff that I want. As a student, Takaichi was a drummer in a heavy metal band and rode a motorcycle, and I have seen multiple photos of her in her youth that make her look like a real-life anime character. She has supported the imperial family's male-only succession, opposes both same-sex marriage, and amending the 19th century law that requires married couples to have the same surname, which is interesting because her husband took her surname before they divorced. So she is a social conservative legally, though, as with Margaret Thatcher, I suppose, she's a bit more flexible in her personal life. But the best part about this is the seething by Japanese leftists who I didn't even think existed. Quote, Miss Takaichi's policies are extremely hawkish, and I doubt she would consider policies to recognize diversity, said Chiako Sato, a political commentator and senior writer for the Mainichi newspaper. Oh no! She isn't going to flood you with infinity Bamalians and pit Japanese women against Japanese men to lower the birth rate even further with contraceptive feminism. I mean, this is great. This sounds excellent, and if they're upset about it, well, it's a badge of endorsement in my book. So what does Takaichi actually want to do? What issues does she want to address in Japan? Well, Japan's GDP has been falling precipitously since its peak in 2012 at 6.27 trillion. It's dropped by about 2 trillion since then and has never recovered despite having a few peaks and troughs. And if you notice, it was doing slightly better under Shinzo Abe and has dropped under his replacement after the assassination. Its GDP per capita, though, has continued to rise, so that's a positive thing. It's $51,685 a head in 2024. And then if you look at some of the other metrics that the World Bank is measuring, we can compare them to the UK. And so they've got a better life expectancy at 84. Japan's actually one of the oldest nations on average. We'll get to that in a bit. Its poverty per head count is 1.2. Its population is 123,975,371 people. So that's double that of the UK. Its population growth annually is 0.4, like negative 0.4. So that means that not only are Japanese people dying more than they're having births, but also Japanese people are, because of the recent uptick in migration, being replaced. And so this must be reversed immediately because their net migration is now 153,357 people every year. Now, I know that sounds like pittance to Britain, whose total migration is about 1.2 million and its net migration is about 700,000. But remember, this is a relatively new phenomena in Japan. They are just at the start of the peak which Britain has endured, see the Boris wave. So if they can stop it now, then they can regain their status as an unquestionable demographic majority. They still are a demographic majority, don't get me wrong, but migration is very much a greased, slippery slope down to becoming a minority in your own country. And so I hope the Japanese turn off the migration tap now before it's too late. Because if you look at the UK, by comparison, its poverty headcount ratio is about half of that of Japan's. Its life expectancy is slightly lower. Its population is about half. Its population growth is 1.1% per year, and that is entirely due to net migration because we have more deaths than we do births nowadays. And as you can see, it says its net migration is 417,114, but that's also not accounting for total migration, and that's not also accounting for the records in previous years. And this is from culturally distant, very costly countries against the express wishes of the British, who have voted against mass migration in every election and referendum since 1974 and been punished with record increases instead. Looking at the average salary in Japan, let's compare it to the UK. So this is from Japan Today, and let's translate some of these because it looks much larger when read out in yen. But, for example, the average earnings for a tradesman is only about £18,000. So that's significantly less than the British minimum wage of about 20-something thousand. And the highest average earnings for electrical, heating and water engineers is only about £36,000. So that's about half of what you would expect for even starting salaries in the United States, and it's about 3/4 of what you would get over in the UK. Now, admittedly, inflation is much lower, cost of living is much cheaper, but it seems like Japan has some economic woes, and as per usual, the same easily refutable arguments are trotted out that in order to address your economic problems and your demographic problems, you need to import this hypothetical GDP rocket fuel that lurks somewhere in the Indian subcontinent, but mysteriously has not empowered India's own economy to be competitive to that of Japan and the UK and the US's. And so I'm mentioning all of this because this is the same sort of set of arguments that is used in my country to flood us with third world migrants, and so I want to build up an immune system for the Japanese so they don't fall for this trick just when they're getting a government that is promising to stop the recent trend of increased migration, especially from the third world. The other argument that's going to make them susceptible to replacement migration is, of course, their falling birth rate. So the Japanese Health Ministry has said that 686,061 babies were born in 2024. That's a drop of 5.7% on the previous year, and the first time the number of newborns fell below 700,000 since records began in 1899, and it's the 16th year of consecutive decline. That's 1/4 of the peak of 2.7 million births in 1949 during the post-war baby boom, when Japan was completely desolated, not just by the nuclear bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but also the relentless fire bombings of Tokyo, the earthquake in Kyoto. Entire cities were leveled, and the country was confused about its national identity, its religion, and its political future. And yet, when basically occupied by an American security force, when undergoing cultural terraforming to de-radicalize them after the Second World War, when their largest cities, including their capital, were burned to a cinder, they were still having a much larger population. So it seems that instead, whatever their current cultural and economic woes are, they're acting as a kind of castrative on Japanese society. Stephen Shaw, who lives in Japan, has explained in his documentary Birth Gap that in 1972, the oil shock caused a dip in the Japanese economy, and that correlated with the first year that birth rates dipped. And he saw the same thing in Germany and Italy as well. And so with each consecutive economic shock, including the one in the 90s where the Japanese stock market had a bit of a wobble, to say the least, the birth rate has dipped and continued to fall and not recovered. So it seems like Japan's specific issues are tied up with their economic issues in terms of their demographics. Now, it could also be to do with feminism because of the mass influx of Japanese women into the workforce, but unlike the West, Japanese use of birth control, contraception, and the pill is much lower. I think the last number I heard was about 3% of Japanese women are on the pill. It turns out that it's just Japanese young people are not coupling up and having sex. Marriages are still pretty consistent, but the number of children that each couple is having is falling. And they're approaching sort of South Korea territory, where in South Korea, the birth rate is so low that the number of dogs each couple has now outnumbered the number of children each couple has. Japan's population of about 124 million people is now projected to fall to 87 million by 2070, with 40% of the population over 65. That would be a great tragedy. Japan is a great civilization and it should not go extinct. And you can see the population tapering off in various graphs. So you can see the population here. In 2000, it sort of reaches its peak of 127 million people, and then now it's dipping down to 123 million people. They've lost about 4 million people over the last 20-odd years, while also increasing their level of migration. Now, one of the reasons for this is because they are the third oldest country by median age. So the median age in Japan is nearly 50. This is an inverse demographic pyramid that cannot be sustained. Japan needs to have more children. It needs to pursue pro-natalist policies that incentivize its young people to couple up, marry, and raise children. And it needs to pursue economic policies that not just create more opportunities, that increase its GDP per capita, that reduce its debt, which is something like 250% of its GDP right now, but also that makes it easier for single income earning households to flourish and prosper again, because that seems to be the best way, not just to raise children, but to incentivize people to have children, to allow women to have the children that they want, judging by opinion polling in various English-speaking countries that I assume is consistent across Japan also. However, what is usually the remedy for demographic downturn, unfunded liabilities like pension commitments and healthcare spending, and economic recession is just import more labourers from overseas, or just import more people if you aren't having enough kids, because immigrants are treated as fungible integers who are indistinguishable from the native population, regardless of their culture, because in the West, we have bought into this blank slate ideology, especially after the Second World War, that says all human beings are fundamentally equal, and all cultural, geographic, economic, and education disparities or differences can be remedied by a state that just invests in providing material resources and education to immigrants and the native population to put them on a level playing field. And this is fundamentally false, because not only do people have different family structures, which then produce different religions and cultures, which then produce different countries, but these intractable commitments to family, ethnicity, identity, religion, nation, culture, they are both stronger for less liberal, less individualistic third world nations, and also people don't shed these commitments when they walk through the passport gates of Tokyo Haneda or Osaka Kansai. So these things will disfigure Japan beyond recognition if this mass demographic experiment that has been played out in my country, in Europe, in America, is allowed to continue playing out in Japan. And so it's very encouraging that Takaichi has said that she wants, yes, friendly relationships with foreign countries, but anyone exploiting Japan's asylum system, its immigration system, anyone who is being disruptive or disrespectful in Japan will be removed, will be denied a visa, will be deterred from their asylum system, and will be sent home. As she says here, as for me, I want to have a calm, mutually considerate relationship with foreigners. So this means that people who are not reciprocal, who are not respectful of Japanese culture, not just being raw economic contributors, but those who do not defer to their hosts as grateful house guests, yes, they will be expelled from the country. That's a very sensible position, and it's a position we should also take. And in order to carry out this agenda, Takaichi has appointed a American-born, half-American, conservative Japanese lawmaker, Kimi Onoda, as the Minister for Orderly Coexistent Society with Foreigners. I think that's a bit of a butchered translation. But she's not just a finance minister, she's also placing a premium on cultural integration with foreigners. And this counts for tourists as well as new immigrants. And it's very encouraging. She's received imperial assent. She's met with the emperor. So the Minister for Remigration now has the approval of Emperor Naruhito. Just as an aside, I like these sort of aesthetics of Japanese traditions. Ever since I've been back, my wife and I have had to stop bowing and sort of like nodding before people when we're saying thank you, because we learned it to do so often, saying "Arigatou gozaimasu" while we were out there to random corner store people. And she has previously said that Japan will not tolerate illegal stays, illegal employment, or the abuse of the system. We will not allow the system, which Japanese people diligently contribute to be exploited. We will aim for zero illegal foreigners and advance effective policies. Basically, Japan is going to do mass deportations and then keep a very watchful eye on the respect for Japanese culture showed by legal migrants and tourists, as is their right. It's very good for them to deter any gaijin which does not show due respect to Japan as their host nation. And this is something that I observed on my trip. Because you might be thinking, well, how big an issue is immigration in Japan? Because we've always upheld Japan as essentially an ethno-state. Like a cohesive, coherent nation with cultural continuity. It's clean, it's polite, it has relatively low surveillance and police presence and enforcement. Its trains run efficiently and cheaply. And it has a lot of self-confidence about prioritizing its people. So why is immigration even a concern in Japan? Well, as I was wandering around, I noticed this. Now, this is a Stop Genocide Free Gaza poster that was outside a business in Kyoto. And if you notice, it's in English first. And the reason is, third worldist Islamic politics is a foreign import in Japan. Islam does not have a long history in Japan. Buddhism, of course, came from a region in India, but Japan has made it ergonomic to its own Shinto practices, and you get these massive sort of totem gods that represent the spirits of different regions. Islam has had no such history in Japan, and so it's a purely alien phenomena, and it's pretty alarming then that there are so many halal restaurants that have opened up in Kyoto. Now, there were some in Osaka, but Kyoto was particularly concentrated, as you can see by this map. Most of these restaurants weren't here in 2023 when I visited. almost to the same week in October. So the explosion in catering for Muslim dietary requirements has been very noticeable. And as I wrote in this tweet, I saw the Palestine sign, I saw lots of halal restaurants, I also saw a lot of Indian serving staff. So when I was going into multiple restaurants, a couple of burger joints, I recommend going to Wagyu to Worldwide, by the way, who, yes, have a halal menu, unfortunately, but their actual regular Japanese Wagyu is fantastic. But when I went into a couple of other restaurants, like Dragon Burger in Kyoto, there was an Indian server. When I went into another burger restaurant, Indian server. When I went to 7-Elevens, Indian servers. Are you really telling me there aren't Japanese people, Japanese teenagers, who aren't eligible to do those jobs? Because I don't think that's the case. This is always the argument, right? We have a skills shortage, we have a decline in the working age population, we have pension commitments to meet, and therefore import limitless numbers of Indians or limitless numbers of Africans in order to fill those jobs. And number one, the idea that a country is reducible purely to its economic output is insulting. But number two, these people will, whether as tourists, whether as guest workers, or whether as citizens, culturally terraform a place, because the more people that gather in a single place, the more they recreate the cultural and economic and aesthetic conditions of their home countries. And so, whether or not this is catering to tourists or new citizens, now Kyoto is awash with halal restaurants. Not very pleasant, I must say. And I did notice as well that in the bathrooms there were a number of signs in English languages telling people how to use the toilets. So I saw signs like this that said, don't stand on the toilet, don't sit facing forward on the toilet, actually sit down on the toilet, don't throw loads of loo roll down the toilet. And let's put it this way. The reason it's in English is because English is a universal language. It's not like English people don't know how to use a toilet. It's not like English people are squatting over the toilet bowl with their feet towards the back of it as if it's the side of a road, for example. So I think we know which nations that don't know how to use a toilet are being instructed by this sign how to use a toilet. And the reason a sign exists, remember, is because someone has done this before. Otherwise, if nobody was doing it, a sign wouldn't need to be put up to tell them not to do it. So, if the Japanese aren't doing it, if the English, the Australians, the Americans aren't doing it, it means that certain predictable nations that don't have functioning plumbing across their country are doing something like this. The Japanese don't have to put up with this. They shouldn't have to have these signs in their bathrooms, but because of the low-level cultural disrespect for Japanese customs that is shown by foreigners out of habit, they need them there. Instead, what you should have is none of the foreigners that disrespect your culture, rather than the signs trying to pick up the pieces of your broken culture that has been broken by the presence of foreigners who don't respect it. So, how is tourism in Japan? Well, the numbers are increasing back to their record. They were a record number in 2019 at 31.88 million, and now in 2024, we don't have the numbers for 2025 yet, it saw 36.87 million. And I must say, I saw a hell of a lot of tourists going around Osaka and Kyoto. And it's obviously hard to tell the difference between immigrants and tourists, between guest workers and new citizens, versus people that are just going on holiday, for example. But I saw a lot of non-Japanese faces walking around the streets. And I saw a lot of non-European, non-Anglosphere tourists or immigrants walking us around the streets too. Definitely not in numbers that I saw in 2023. And this is having an impact on the number of businesses and restaurants that are opened in Japanese areas, and on the number of signs that they need telling people to have basic civic sense, which doesn't exist in the Indian subcontinent, parts of China, and the rest of the third world. According to Japan National Tourism Organization, that's the JNTO, and the Japan Tourism Agency, 36.9 million tourists visited Japan in 2024, and this is surpassing the previous record of 2019 by 16%. Now, this brings in 1.9 trillion US dollars to the Japanese economy, but if your economy is reliant on international tourism, then you aren't a country anymore. You're not a home. You're a museum or an amusement park. And by the way, I went and visited Ghibli Park, and you don't want to be an amusement park if that's the standards of Japanese amusement parks. It was a pretty depressing affair with very scant attractions. It was just a series of soulless photo ops. I don't want to see Japan turn into that. I want to see it thrive and be alive and be confident in itself. So I think it should reassess its relationship with tourism, particularly from certain regions. Now, these are the top 5 sources of tourism for Japan. South Korea with 8.8 million visitors, China with 6.9 million visitors, Taiwan with 6 million visitors, United States with 2.7 million visitors, and Hong Kong with 2.6 million visitors. The differentiation of Hong Kong and Taiwan being a thumb in the eye to China there, which I appreciate. However, none of these nations are Muslim majority, so what's with all of the halal restaurants, I hear you ask? I saw a lot of Malaysian and Indonesian tourists in hijabs and headscarves while I was out there, and about 1 million people from those two nations come to Japan every year. A further 230,000 come from India, and 160,000 from the Middle East, the Emiratis, Dubai, Bahrain, etc. This is having a disproportionate impact on the businesses, the restaurants, the culture of Japan. And so, Prime Minister Takaichi should instruct her ministers to have a look at whether or not this is worth it, because I really don't think it is. As someone living in Britain who sees Japan as experiencing the thin end of the wedge of mass demographic and cultural change, I must advise, not a good idea to continue this. How many are tourists and how many are permanent settlers? Well, it's hard to get concrete numbers, but let's look at Osaka, one of the places that I visited. As of January 1st, 2024, Osaka's total population reached 2,757,642, which was an increase of 16,055 from the previous year. Now again, that doesn't sound like very many, especially compared to the number of people concentrated in London. But recognise that the people moving in and out, the difference between people moving in and out in Japan, was the highest in Osaka, 31,780. That's more than double Yokohama's 15,802. And foreigners accounted for 53.5% of this increase. So 17,006 new foreign residents moved to Osaka in 2023 alone. So there were more foreign residents moving to Osaka than its net population growth, which means demographic replacement. Now, I couldn't tell how many people who are obviously not tourists from America, Australia, the UK, and Western Europe were tourists versus permanent settlers and immigrants. However, the fact that immigrants are now outnumbering the number of people that are growing the population in Japan means that the growth in Osaka, which is the top city in Japan for population growth in that year, is entirely attributable to foreign nationals. So again, this is the thin end of the wedge of the national trend that Britain is seeing, where its only population growth, its annual population growth of 1%, is entirely attributable to mass third world migration. So why are they coming? Well, here's one case study from the New York Times. This is Kuchan, a town near the Niseko ski slopes, and locals are concerned about the fact that 1,200 seasonal workers, immigrant labour, are going to be imported to engage in construction efforts to try and create new tourism sites. So immigrants are imported to build infrastructure for tourists. So Japan is just becoming a revolving door of foreign nationals who are either here on temporary work visas or temporary tourist visas, or trying to settle in Japan to benefit from the largesse of its decent GDP per capita, its high trust society, its low levels of crime, and the kind of function and cleanliness you would expect from a homogenous, high IQ, conscientious population. But the more people that get added to that mix, the less intelligent, the less conscientious, the less orderly, and the less cohesive Japan becomes, and so their very presence is degrading Japanese culture. On that plot of land, developers are planning to construct lodging for up to 1,200 seasonal workers, most of whom will be foreigners. These labourers are needed to operate the area's resorts and construction sites. No, they're not. You're just not willing to pay Japanese people enough to do it. These foreign labourers are never needed, right? Unless they are exporting a brand new and novel technology to Japan, which only ever seems to come from Western Europe or America, as we'll get onto later, these people are not a necessity. There is no hidden treasure, GDP fuel, lurking somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa that Japan just needs to mine like an ore vein, because if it was, it would already flow abundantly and turn Africa into Wakanda, or India into the promised superpower by 2030. They just don't need it. And this is why local residents are petitioning the government to block the facility, citing concerns over safety and a perceived decline in social order. It's not perceived. Any crime, any act of disrespect shown to Japanese culture by a tourist, by an immigrant, by a foreigner is optional as a result of government policy. That person never needed to be in the country in the first place, and so the government can just say no, and the Japanese will be spared from these costs, crimes, and indignities. And the same holds true for my country, and I want us to take the same approach. So this has prompted protests across Japan. Here's an article from an Indian news outlet, and that's pertinent, about the protest that erupted in Saitama a couple of years ago after Kurdish, Indian, and Pakistani immigrants moved to the country and started committing low-level crimes and sexual assaults. And I must note as well that when I was there this year, I noticed a lot more Nepalese and Indian restaurants propping up all over Japan flying the Indian flag. If you're in their country, do not fly your own flag, because that is an exercise of colonial dominance. You shouldn't be doing that. And this is a very subversive article. The Indian press are kind of famous for that. It says, in Indian culture, guests are considered deities. In Japan, the word omotenashi is used for guests, meaning to welcome them with warmth and respect. However, in Japan today, public anger against Muslims, particularly Kurdish immigrants, is evident on the streets. This means a major campaign against Muslims is underway in Japan. So the Indians are sensing that the rising tide of nativist Japanese politics might pull up the drawbridge for Indian labourers. And India, being heavily reliant on remittances, especially from my country, is threatened by that. I suppose the presence of Indians in Japan also helps to explain why the toilet signs are necessary. How many Indians are in Japan? Well, we have to rely on Wikipedia for this number because I found it hard to find any sources that were translated, but it opens with, as of December 2024, there were 53,974 Indian nationals living in Japan. Why? Japan doesn't need a single Indian. If these Indians were uniquely industrious, India would have kept hold of them. Because India, again, wants to be an economic superpower and is very boastful about its leap into industry and is very proud of its culture. What's happening is India has an excess male population and it's dispersing them around the globe like some kind of bioweapon, frankly, and deploying them in countries so that their labour can siphon off economic productivity in countries like Britain and Japan and send it back to the motherland. This is why Modi calls them living bridges, a term that our former Home Secretary and current Shadow Foreign Secretary, Priti Patel, also used to describe her fellow Indian immigrants, of which she let in 250,000 every year. And this is what Japan will see as well, because if it honours the deal, as reported here by Asian News Network, that its former Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, made with Prime Minister Modi to have 500,000 people exchange countries between India and Japan over the next 5 years, which means 500,000 Indians moving to Japan, because I don't see Japanese people moving to India in their hundreds of thousands, do you? Then Japan will be facing the same prospects that the British have. It says in this article, as well, that of the 500,000 people, 50,000 are expected to be highly skilled Indians with specialised knowledge who will work in Japan. Why does Japan need 450,000 low-wage, low-skilled Indians who probably don't speak Japanese, who don't revere Japanese culture, and will just send money back to India? Yet again, any deal the Indians makes unilaterally advantages India by dispersing their excess, troublesome male population across the globe, which inevitably results in more sexual assaults and political unrest in the countries they go to, while also getting more money in remittances. And the Indian economy is disproportionately reliant on remittances, by the way. You look at the Japanese and the British economy, their remittance rate is less than 1%, whereas the personal remittances received as a share of GDP in India is 3.5%. So India have a parasitic economic relationship with lots of other countries, and despite saying that they are providing highly skilled immigrants across the globe, no, they're not, and they're also responsible for a disproportionate number of scam calls and bot campaigns on social media that siphon away income and retirement savings of people from our countries. So we shouldn't be allowing Indian migrants in Britain, and the Japanese certainly shouldn't be honouring the deal of the last Prime Minister. Takaichi should cancel it, and she should encourage the cheap Indian labour that have not assimilated into Japan and never will to return to India because they have a country to go back to. There's also a deal that they cut with 4 African countries. Now, this is the project known as the JICA African Hometown Initiative, and the Japanese International Cooperation Agency has assigned Kizarazu in Chiba Prefecture as the hometown for Nigerians, Nagai in Yamagata for Tanzanians, Sanjo in Niigata for Ghanaians, and Imbari in Ehime for Mozambicans. I apologise if I mispronounced any of those Japanese prefectures. there has not been a single African person that has contributed anything really of value to Japanese history. So why are any of these cities now designated homelands for Nigerians, Tanzanians, Ghanaians, and Mozambicans? Like, we all saw the complete farce of the Assassin's Creed game that said Yasuke, who was essentially like a horseboy to one of the samurai, was actually a great black Japanese samurai. Total joke. Why are we engaging in historical revisionism? And why does Japan need to partner its cities with African nations? Unless it's, of course, to import more Africans. Now, bear in mind, it says in here, hastily, the ministry clarified there are no plans to introduce measures promoting immigration or to issue special visas for African residents, stressing that recent reports suggesting otherwise are inaccurate. Then why sign the deal? If it's purely symbolic, if it's not to manufacture consent to say Africans are as Japanese as you and me, because their homelands' names are on our road signs now, therefore we admit them, then what's the purpose of it? It is to turn Japan into a revolving door for third world immigrants and cheap foreign labour. Living bridges, as Modi once said. The Japanese should cancel this deal, they should cancel the Indian deal. Japan doesn't need Africans, Japan doesn't need Indians, it needs more Japanese people, and it should be as Japanese as possible. Now, what are the consequences of acquiescing to this just the tip approach with migration? Well, crime is increasing in Japan. Now, is this attributable purely to migrants? Well, correlation doesn't equal causation, as Reddit routinely reminds me. However, it seems like foreigners are disproportionately overrepresented in crime despite being a small share of the Japanese population. So this is from Nippon.com. The number of reported crimes in Japan has fallen for 2 decades, following a peak in 2002 with 2.85 million, but since 2022, when tourism has increased and when immigration has increased, it's been on the rise. In 2023, it showed a slight drop of 6% compared to 2019, but the number of street crimes, robberies, purse snatchings, bicycle thefts, assault, and extortion was 21% higher. The National Police Agency believes this is due to a more active flow of people since the downgrading of COVID-19, aka migration, both tourism and in terms of settlement visas. A total of 12,372 major crimes were reported in 2023, a 29.8% increase over the previous year, so nearly a 30% increase in major crime. The crimes included murder, robbery, arson, rape and indecent assault, and kidnapping and trafficking. Cases of murder and robbery increased slightly to 912 and 131,361 respectively. Meanwhile, cases of rape and indecent assault rose by more than 1,000, with 2,711 and 6,096 cases respectively. Those are thousands of sexual assaults that Japanese people could have lived without. How much are foreigners to blame for this? Well, the crime rate was 4.7% in 2022, and as this article points out, according to the latest information from October 2023 from Japan's Immigration Services Agency, there were 2,939,000 long-term foreign residents in Japan as of June 2023. There are also 284,807 special permanent residents. So that makes for a total of about 3 million immigrants in Japan. That's up 4.8 from the previous year. So, the foreign population of Japan is 2.5%, and the crime rate for foreigners is 4.7%. So that means that foreign nationals, and that's not broken down by ethnicity, which is predictable in literally every nation, foreign nationals as a category are responsible for 2 times the amount of crime to their share of the population. So they are overrepresented by a factor of 2 in committing crimes. And remember, even though this article says the statistics are clear, if your goal is to reduce crime in Japan, targeting foreigners isn't a wise use of money or resources, every single crime committed by a foreign national is optional. They didn't need to be in the country, they didn't need to be there to ruin a life. Therefore, Japan should take in no foreigners who are likely, predictably so, to commit crimes. And so, Takaichi should take note of this. She should close Japan's borders to the regions of the world, like India, who are predictable perpetrators of violent crimes and thefts. It says here as well, 61.1% of the crimes committed by foreigners are theft, only 11.3% are violence or body injury, 6.6% are fraud. Okay, literally all of those crimes never needed to happen though. So, I don't care about your I don't care about your attempts to diminish the stats. Japan should not be putting up with this. And how could you possibly see this coming? Well, this is what foreigners think of Japan before they even come here. This is just one post that is illustrative of the third world mindset about the Japanese. It's blaming them for genocide, it's saying that they committed war crimes, it's saying that they aren't sufficiently progressive enough, that they themselves have a culture of sexual assault on public transport, or that they over-sexualize women in anime, and so they're therefore a disgusting country. And as the quote post says, you'll never guess where the original poster is from. Pakistan. Okay, don't let any of them in. If they hold this view of you as being collectively inferior to Pakistani culture, just close your borders to Pakistan. Seems like a very sensible measure because Japan doesn't need a single Pakistani in the country. Japan is perfectly fine being practically 100% Japanese. And I hope that Takaichi pursues that exact policy. Why do I care so much, though? This is something you might be asking. Well, I'm just going to pull up some photos from my trip, just to make some aesthetic and subjective observations about this, because I think a lot of this gets lost when just discussing raw data. Japan is a beautiful country, and it's a shame to me when I see scenes like this from Nagoya, where they're just building these inhumane corporate insect hives for people to waste their lives on graph-making make-work jobs, and not have a family, but also not have present in their lives the capacity that Japanese culture has uniquely for great beauty. Because nobody is happy living in these scenes. This could be anywhere, by the way. This is the architecture of global replacist ideology. Because remember, replacist ideology is the blank slate applied to borders. And this is usually downstream of market forces that treat people like fungible, interchangeable economic integers. And so the architecture that basically imprisons people in these make-work battery farms has to be standardized across every nation. And so if it weren't for the advertising in kanji and the cute Japanese characters that usually feature in Japanese advertising, this could be downtown Detroit or Chicago or London or any other European city ravaged by mass migration. This could be some slum in Brussels, for all you know. And it's sad to see the Japanese doing this. Osaka is not a beautiful city. It's filled with great people. It's filled with fun little interesting things, and Osaka Castle is wonderful to visit. But compared to somewhere like Kyoto, which used to be Japan's capital, and I think it should be again, it just doesn't speak to the spirit of the Japanese people. What does speak to the spirit of Japanese people are their temples, their shrines, their well-cared-for heritage sites, the businesses that Japanese people proudly keep clean and inviting to new customers. This is Kiyomizu-dera, for example, in Kyoto. This is the Imperial Palace in Kyoto. This is the castle in Nijo. Look how old these places are. Look how in such good condition they are, despite having been repeatedly burned down by fires. Pretty much every building has been just incinerated in Japan over the centuries, but loads of these were built in, the 7th century and have been kept in pristine and beautiful condition ever since, because the Japanese are a very conscientious, very self-confident people, and they are capable of building these beautiful structures. And this is just another temple that we stumbled upon in Kyoto. This is the wonderful palace in Nara, where you've got this colossal Buddha statue, and these sort of gate guardians that look like they're something out of a From Software game that greet you as you go through the main gate. This is the Kamo River that runs straight through Kyoto, and we spent a lot of time just wandering down it in the golden hour, the burning sunset, looking at the beautiful ducks and various birds that were fishing in the river. There are these sort of themed stepping stones that look like boats and manta rays and turtles put in the water. All of these things just show how wonderful Japan is and how capable it is of building beautiful buildings again. And this is something that can help foster a sense of belonging that means that people actually want to bring children into a world that feels welcoming and familiar to them. It's hard to raise children in a soulless glass and concrete skyscraper-dominated city because there's a constant transient population churn. Almost by design, these places populated with Towers of Babel act as magnets for the international business class who bring with them in their wake the hungry mouths and held out hands of the third world who want to take from wealthier nations' largesse. And so cities kind of act as a gravity well for migrants. Whereas instead, if you stopped building and designing your cities, your towns, according to market demand, and instead put some traditional Japanese flavors in your architecture, you might make it a more familiar and particularly Japanese place to raise Japanese families as custodians of Japanese culture again. This particular temple is Nanzenji, and the reason that I've got a photo of it is because it's right next to this beautiful Victorian aqueduct. And this is one of my favorite places in Japan. We went here twice when we visited about a week or so ago. I went here in 2023 as well. And this is a joint venture with the British. This was built in the 19th century, and it funnels water from atop the aqueduct, which is still functioning today, even though it's not Japan's primary water source, because now they've got obviously underground pipes that clean and filter the water and bring it to different homes. But it's still functioning today, and it runs throughout the neighborhoods in Kyoto, and it has this sort of beautiful sound and beautiful aesthetic. Also, very curious that the Japanese don't feel the need for such eyesores of health and safety because they're just intelligent and conscientious. They don't need to put up massive railings everywhere. People just don't fall in small streams because they're quite sensible. But these sorts of things were built by friendly nations who were similar in intelligence, in conscientiousness, in approach to the world. And the best example of this was actually when we went to visit the train museum, because my wife got the dinosaurs and trains flavour of autism, so she insisted that we go and visit the Kyoto Railway Museum. And it was a fascinating day out, not just because she got to ride the steam train and look at the Shinkansen, but because there were signs like this that told the story of the development of Japanese railways. And I think this is very instructive. This is why I care. Because in the 19th century, the Japanese brought over as temporary advisors, not permanent settlers in most cases, certainly not fake refugees, European, so mainly Dutch and British, and some American engineers to explain to them how to build the railways. And the first railway opened on the 14th of October in 1872 with its official opening ceremony. It was operational since July, but they had to have an official opening ceremony in the presence of Emperor Meiji, after whom the Meiji Restoration was named. And what's fascinating about the Japanese railways, and I'm translating some of this from the kanji because they didn't have an English language sign, which I frankly respect, is that this altered the Japanese conception of time. See my previous video on how Africa thinks for how different cultures have historically and continue to think about time in a way which is either non-linear or not quantified, or has no conception of the future even. The traditional Japanese conception of time not just followed the lunar calendar, but also had it based on the seasons. So it wasn't that there were a fixed number of days in the month, it wasn't that there were a fixed number of months in the year, it wasn't there a fixed number of hours in the day. Instead, it was just this season lasted as long as this season did. So they just eyeballed it. And with the introduction of trains and the introduction of train timetables came the introduction of the European and American time system. And so this revolutionized Japan. And this is actually the theme of The Last Samurai. This is a small way that sort of technological progress had a ratchet effect towards homogenizing Japan until its various cities began to resemble these ugly urban sprawls from Nagoya. But also, and this is perhaps some of the sentiment that Takaichi's accused post-war revisionism is tapping into in perhaps more benign way, the idea is that the Meiji Restoration wasn't an unalloyed good just because it brought technological progress to Japan. This is the theme of The Last Samurai, right? It's the idea that proud Japanese culture gave way to the forces of international commerce. And what I would advise Japan is, yes, you might feel a pressure to rectify your dreadful debt to GDP situation. You might feel a pressure to increase your demographics just to make pension commitments or ensure that your economy is stable. But you can endure economic hardship. What you can't endure is a total disintegration and replacement of your population and your culture. And so, what I would hope the next Japanese government does is not just prioritize the economic interests of its people, but place a primacy on preserving the culture and heritage of Japan, even if it comes at the expense of economics, because you will have expedient economic arguments for importing lots of foreign labor, but this will not recreate the culture and therefore the country of Japan over generations. So prioritize the continuity of your culture and your country over short-term economic gains. The last thing I want to observe is this railway map. So in the museum, it shows where the railways opened in each country, and you can see in Britain in 1825 and in Ireland in 1834, and then it's sort of cascaded across Europe and the Americas. And if we look down to Japan, their first railway opened in 1872, which we've already mentioned. In China, various areas of China, it opened a bit later in the 19th century. If we go over to places like India, around the same time because of the British occupation, but if we go over to Africa, it's the early 20th century in many cases, or the late 19th. One down the bottom is 1964. And this just shows the respective level of development that each country is capable of. And it is emphasized even more, as you can see from my previous video on how Africa thinks, that the Japanese are still maintaining JR, Japanese Railway, as a state-owned company with incredibly efficient trains that come every few minutes and are very affordable, and have upgraded it to have the Shinkansen, a fast, clean, and comfortable train that allows you to travel cross-country in a matter of hours, versus the railways that were just left behind by the Africans and have not been maintained because they don't have a word in many languages for maintenance. They've fallen to a state of disrepair and have infuriated now their Chinese colonists who have gone as part of the Belt and Road to apparently build up African infrastructure, but who have found themselves frustrated by trying to work with African labourers who just don't understand things like diligence and excellence and timekeeping. And so I'm making this point to say that Britain and Japan, despite having very different aesthetics and religions and histories, are very similar. We're very conscientious. Japan is like the Britain of the Orient. I mean, they're an island nation. This kind of has an effect on your people, your climate, your culture. Whereas various other nations are not like us. India, Africa, the Middle East. They will instead come over and recreate the conditions of their country and add little to nothing to your culture and your infrastructure. And so this might be an example of positive cultural exchange. I think the Japanese railways is basically the best in the world. Though, even positive cultural exchange with the British, the Europeans, and the Americans still had a contested effect on how traditional Japanese culture can survive. And so I'm not just saying that this is a trade-off that the Takaichi government should consider and then make, but also I'm hoping Japan restores itself to its former glory, gets itself out of its demographic ditch, improves its economy without sacrificing its culture, because when we win in Britain, hopefully in a couple of years, because we don't have more than one election cycle to fix our country, because our demographic, economic, and culture situation is far more dire than anything Japan has experienced. When we win, I would love to partner with the Japanese. The Japanese are on my very short list of countries from which I would allow temporary high-skilled workers to come to Britain and contribute before going home, or spousal visas, because they're proximate, they're peaceful, they have low levels of crime, they're net economic contributors, and they're quite similar in temperament to us, despite being a bit more passive-aggressive than the directness of Brits, Australians, and Americans. And judging by the sorry state of British rail these days, when we eventually, likely, make the railways public again, I would love the Japanese to come over and help us build a Shinkansen from London to Glasgow. I think we're going to need their help in our infrastructure, in how to run a functioning civic society again. And so I want Japan to become a model nation, to reject mass migration, to boost its birth rate, to improve its economy, and to become a proud nation of its rich history and culture again, so that they can prove that Britain can do it too. Japan Banzai. And I hope if this was translated into Japanese, that anyone living in Nippon really enjoyed it.